Bring dying plants back to life with this ancient gardening method. There's a plant somewhere right now on a windowsill or a back porch that's been drooping for weeks no matter what gets done to it. More water, less water, a new pot, a sunnier spot. Nothing changes. The leaves keep curling, the stems keep softening, and at some point most people quietly decide the plant is done and move it to the compost pile or the curb. But the plant usually isn't broken. It's missing one step that used to be common knowledge in almost every household that grew its own food, and now almost never gets mentioned. That step doesn't come from a garden center shelf, and it isn't written on any label. It comes from a tree most people walk past every single day without a second glance. And once you understand what that tree quietly does for a struggling plant, it's hard to look at a dying houseplant the same way again. Because this isn't really about one wilting fern or one stubborn tomato seedling. It's about a habit that used to be ordinary, passed down without anyone thinking twice about it, and somewhere along the way it quietly stopped being taught. And this is where the real problem begins. What people see. Most people assume a struggling plant has one of two problems: too much water or not enough. So the instinct is always the same. Adjust the watering schedule. Move the pot to better light. Maybe add a dose of fertilizer because fertilizer feels like medicine. Something to give the plant a boost back toward health. When none of that works, the next step is usually a trip to the store. A bottle of plant revival spray. A packet of root stimulant powder. The thing that gets overlooked is willow water. Water that's been steeped with the bark and young twigs of a willow tree. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and that's probably part of why it quietly disappeared from common use. But the reason it works isn't folklore or guesswork. It's chemistry that has been documented for a long time and is still well understood today. Willow trees naturally produce two distinct groups of compounds that matter here. The first is salicylic acid, a hormone plants use internally to signal that they're under stress and need to mount some kind of defense or repair response. It's part of how a plant coordinates recovery at a cellular level when something has gone wrong. The second is a group of natural auxins, plant growth hormones closely related to the compound most commercial rooting products are built around, that specifically trigger new root development at the site of a cut or a damaged root. When willow bark and young stems are steeped in water, both of these compound groups leach out into that water. Use that water on a stressed, wilting, or recently transplanted plant, and the effect isn't just hydration. It's the delivery of the same internal signals a plant already uses on its own to repair root damage and stabilize itself after a shock. This is usually overlooked precisely because it doesn't look like a treatment in the way people expect one to look. There's no label, no dosage chart, no brand name attached to it. It's just water that sat near some twigs overnight. But the underlying mechanism is the same one synthetic rooting products were designed to copy in the first place. And in some cases, the synthetic version is a near-direct chemical relative of what the willow was already producing on its own. This wasn't a one-off discovery from a single source, either. Variations of the same basic technique, using willow specifically to help cuttings root or to revive a struggling transplant, turn up across multiple separate gardening traditions over a long stretch of time, among home growers and small-scale propagators who had no formal connection to each other, which is usually a sign that something real is being observed and repeated rather than a single piece of folklore being passed along unchanged. And this is the part most people miss. Willow water isn't an old wives' tale standing in for real science. It's closer to the original source the science was eventually built from. Why this changed? So if it works, and it's nearly free, why did it disappear from common knowledge? The honest answer isn't one single event. It's an accumulation of small, individually reasonable shifts that all happen to pull in the same direction over time. As commercial plant nurseries scaled up through the middle of the 20th century, growers needed something more consistent than steep tree bark, a product with a known concentration, a predictable shelf life, and a dosage that could be printed on a label and repeated exactly the same way every single time. Research during that period identified and isolated the specific auxin compounds responsible for rooting, and synthetic versions of those same compounds were developed and standardized for commercial use. That made complete sense for a greenhouse propagating thousands of identical cuttings on a tight production schedule, where a slight variation in potency could mean a tray of unsold plants. From there, the synthetic version became the default recommendation passed along through garden centers, agricultural extension offices, and gardening media that increasingly relied on product partnerships to fund their content. Not because the natural version stopped working, but because the manufactured version was easier to package, store, regulate, and sell at scale. There's also a simpler financial reality underneath all of it. A synthetic compound formulated into a branded product can be patented, packaged, and sold repeatedly. A tree branch steeped in tap water cannot. That difference alone shaped which version had institutional support behind it and which version had to survive purely through word of mouth between neighbors and relatives, which is a much more fragile way for any piece of knowledge to stay alive across generations. At roughly the same time, a lot of urban and suburban landscaping quietly moved away from willow trees specifically. They were considered messy by some homeowners, fast-growing in ways that needed constant pruning, and their root systems developed a reputation, fair or not, for interfering with underground pipes and foundations. Fewer willows in everyday landscapes meant fewer households with casual, free access to the raw material in the first place. Add in a few generations of gardening knowledge being learned mostly from product packaging and big-box store end caps instead of from a parent or grandparent doing it by hand in the yard, and the practice didn't get banned or buried on purpose. It simply stopped getting demonstrated, one household at a time, until it wasn't common knowledge anymore, to the point that most people today have never heard the term willow water at all. Consequence. The consequence of that shift is quieter than it sounds, but it shows up constantly for anyone who grows plants regularly. A transplant shock or a damaged root system used to be something a gardener could try to talk a plant back from using something already growing in the yard, at no cost and with no waiting for a delivery. Now, the more common outcome is that the plant just gets written off because the perceived fix requires a specific purchase, and not everyone has the right product sitting in a drawer at the exact moment a plant needs it. Anyone who's ever moved a houseplant collection across an apartment, divided a perennial in the garden, or tried to root a cutting from a friend's plant has likely run into this exact wall. The plant goes into shock, the leaves drop, and the response is usually to wait and hope, sometimes for weeks, rather than actively support the recovery. A home gardener starting tomato seedlings each spring is a good example of how normalized this has become. Losing a portion of those seedlings during the move from a seed tray into the ground gets treated as an unavoidable part of the process, an expected cost of doing business every single season, rather than a specific, addressable kind of stress that has a known response. There's also a meaningful difference in how the two methods behave once they're actually applied. Synthetic rooting hormones are typically formulated at higher, fixed concentrations for speed and consistency, which is genuinely useful in a commercial setting with trained staff and standardized procedures, but a slightly imprecise application on a small or delicate houseplant can sometimes do more harm than good, occasionally burning tender root tissue rather than helping it. Willow water's effect tends to be gentler and more self-limiting, partly because the compound concentration is naturally lower and more variable from batch to batch, which is exactly the trait that made it commercially inconvenient to standardize, but is also part of why it was historically considered safe enough to use freely and often without much risk of overdoing it. Beyond the plants themselves, there's a cost that adds up quietly over a gardening lifetime. Small plastic bottles and foil packets bought again and again for something that, for most of history, came from a tree branch and a jar of water left on a counter overnight. There's also an emotional cost that doesn't get talked about much. People who lose plant after plant during transplanting often start to believe they simply don't have a talent for it, when in a lot of cases the missing piece wasn't skill at all. It was a tool that used to be common knowledge and quietly stopped being passed along. That belief tends to compound over time, too. A few failed transplants in a row is often enough for someone to decide gardening just isn't for them, when the actual gap was never about effort or attention in the first place. This connects directly to how plant care in general has changed over the past several decades. Fewer free, hands-on methods passed between people, and more purchasable replacements for things that used to just be local, ordinary knowledge nobody thought to write down. Practical shift. Making willow water doesn't require anything specialized, and it's worth walking through exactly how it's done, because the method matters as much as the explanation. Any tree in the genus Salix works, weeping willow, pussy willow, and most common ornamental willow varieties are all suitable, and they're planted widely enough that most regions have access to at least one nearby, whether that's a backyard, a local park, a stream bank, or even a neighbor's tree with permission. The part that matters most is the young growth. Thin, flexible green or yellow-green stems and a bit of the surrounding bark, not thick old wood, since the concentration of active compounds is highest in actively growing tissue. A small handful is genuinely enough for a batch, and healthy willows recover from light trimming quickly. So taking a few young branch tips from a healthy tree doesn't cause any real harm to it. There are two basic ways to prepare it, and the choice mostly comes down to how much time is available. The slower method is a cold steep. Chop the twigs and bark into smaller pieces, cover them with room temperature water, and let the mixture sit for 24 to 48 hours, ideally somewhere cool and out of direct sun. The faster method is a hot steep. Simmer the chopped material in water for about half an hour, then let it cool completely and continue steeping for several more hours or overnight before straining. The hot method pulls more of the compound out faster, which matters when a plant needs help immediately rather than in a day or two. Either way, once it's strained through a cloth or fine sieve to remove the solid material, the resulting liquid can be used a few specific ways. For a wilting or recently transplanted plant, one regular watering can simply be replaced with the willow water instead of plain water, applied directly to the soil at the base of the plant. For a cutting that's being rooted, or a bare root plant about to be replanted, soaking the roots directly in the willow water for a few hours before planting tends to give the most noticeable result, since the compounds reach the root tissue immediately instead of filtering down slowly through soil over days. It isn't meant to be used like a fertilizer on a regular schedule, and that's an important distinction. This is a targeted tool for moments of stress, transplant shock, or active rooting, not an everyday additive poured on out of habit. Using it constantly doesn't meaningfully speed up a perfectly healthy plant, since a stable plant isn't sending out the same stress signals a struggling one is. It's also worth being honest about what it doesn't do. It won't reverse root rot caused by chronic overwatering, since that's a tissue damage and fungal problem rather than a signaling problem. It won't fix a pest infestation, and it won't correct a genuine nutrient deficiency in the soil. What it does is give a plant that's still structurally capable of recovering the specific internal signal it needs to actually begin that recovery, instead of just sitting in soil indefinitely while nothing changes. Freshly brewed willow water is most effective used within a few days, since the active compounds break down over time, so making a fresh small batch as needed tends to work better than trying to store a large supply for months. For anyone without easy access to a willow tree, it's worth mentioning that aspirin, which contains a closely related compound to the salicylic acid found naturally in willow bark, has sometimes been used as a rough substitute dissolved in water, though dosing that version is far less forgiving, and the natural version remains the gentler and more reliable option where a willow tree is available at all. It also helps to know what to actually expect afterward, since recovery isn't usually instant. A plant treated with willow water during transplant shock typically shows the first visible signs of stabilizing within 1 to 2 weeks. New growth at the tips, leaves that stop dropping, stems that firm back up instead of continuing to soften. That timeline is similar to what a synthetic rooting product would produce, since both are working through a related mechanism. If a plant shows no improvement at all after a few weeks, that's a useful signal in itself, since it usually points toward a different underlying problem entirely, like root rot, a pest issue at the roots, or compacted soil that's suffocating what's left of the root system, rather than something willow water alone was ever going to solve. It's also worth treating the cause and not just the symptom. Willow water works best paired with otherwise sound basics: a pot with proper drainage, soil that isn't waterlogged, and a planting depth that isn't burying the stem. Used alongside those basics rather than instead of them, it tends to make the difference between a transplant that struggles for a month and one that barely seems to notice it was moved at all. This isn't the first time a piece of free, hands-on knowledge like this has quietly faded out once a manufactured version became available, and it almost never happens because the original stopped working. It happens because the manufactured version was easier to scale. Once this pattern becomes visible in one place, it tends to show up again almost everywhere a person looks. Willow water isn't really the whole story here. It's one example of a much broader shift: practical, low-cost, hands-on knowledge that used to move from household to household, replaced not because it failed, but because it couldn't be standardized, packaged, and sold the same way a manufactured product can. The same basic shape of story shows up in food preservation, where fermenting vegetables, curing meat, and making simple cultured dairy at home largely gave way to shelf-stable packaged alternatives that don't require any waiting, any guesswork, or any inherited technique. It shows up in soil health, where compost, crop rotation, and naturally occurring soil fungi that form partnerships with plant roots gave way to bagged fertilizer blends with a guaranteed nutrient analysis printed clearly on the front, easier to trust at a glance even when the underlying soil biology is quietly being depleted in the process. It shows up in seed saving, where households used to save seed from their strongest plants each season, adapting that seed slowly to local conditions year after year. Before that practice was mostly replaced by buying fresh seed packets annually. It shows up in pest control as well, where companion planting and other low-cost deterrents grown directly into a garden bed gave way to bottled pesticide sprays that promise faster, more uniform results in a single application. None of these shifts happened because the older methods stopped working. Willow water still produces real auxins. Fermentation still preserves food safely when done correctly. Soil fungi still help roots access nutrients they couldn't reach alone. Companion planting still deters the pests it was always observed to deter. What changed wasn't the effectiveness of any of it. What changed was which version was easier to manufacture, ship, shelve, and repeat exactly the same way at scale, store after store, season after season. A market built around consistent, repeatable products will always have an easier time promoting those products than promoting something that grows a little differently in every backyard and can't be put on a label with a fixed dosage or a guaranteed shelf life. None of this requires a hidden plan or a villain behind it. It's mostly just a function of scale, repeated quietly across dozens of small, separate decisions over several decades. This isn't the first time this kind of quiet substitution has happened, and based on how consistently the pattern repeats across completely unrelated areas, it's unlikely to be the last. This same pattern, a free, traditional method quietly replaced by something purchasable, not because it failed but because it couldn't be standardized, shows up again almost identically in how food gets preserved, how soil gets fed, how gardens get protected from pests, and how a household used to stay stocked without a store run for every small problem that came up. And once that pattern is visible in one of those areas, it gets noticeably harder to miss in the others. None of it requires believing anyone set out to hide it. It mostly just requires noticing how often the free, hands-on version and the purchasable version solve the exact same problem, and how quietly one of them stopped getting mentioned. This is part of a series looking at the everyday things that quietly changed shape over the last few generations, one ordinary practice at a time, without anyone deciding it all at once. And the next one is even harder to ignore once this one has been seen clearly.